everyone, I'm Ari here with Rachel and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week we're on episode 201 and we're asking, do you need an editing checklist? Before we dive into the topic, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening if you haven't already, and if you enjoy the show, please share it with friends and feel free to write a review. Okay, so checklist. If you are editing, it can be a little bit like nebulous about what you need to do. Obviously, most people think, oh yeah, I need to check like spellings and grammar and all this, but a checklist can actually be really useful to kind of pull in and hone down all the pieces you need to do. And I think it's a good idea to break the checklist into categories. Now, obviously, you've already got the editing, which is, like line editing, developmental editing. So it's not really like a developmental edit. Try and do that first, because that's that nice big structural thing. But when you're coming down to like more of the minutia, this is what I recommend. Everybody recommends, I assume. So have some categories, and these could be things like names, dialogue, POV, and then within those categories, you should try and figure out what sort of things you want to look at while you're editing. So we're going to give you a few examples of the different categories you can pick and the things you should be looking into, just to make editing easier, because I don't know about you, but I get overwhelmed when I have to think about editing, because you sit here going, I'm going to edit my manuscript, and that is a big task. So breaking it down into like a smaller task is brilliant. Let's start with names. You want to do a spell check for your characters' names. And this is super important if you've amended the characters' names when you started writing. Now, I did this recently. I changed the name. It was the name of one character and the name of a place. And I changed them. One was slightly and one was completely different. And I kept finding the wrong name as I was writing. So definitely do a search check on your characters' names and make sure every single one of them is spelled correctly. Especially if you've got weird names that maybe your spell check would have already put up. And maybe you've done what I do, where it's like, add to dictionary. And then it doesn't come up anymore. I did read a novel not that long ago, and the character's name had changed, and you could find out because it was all the way right to the very end, and then it changed spelling, and it obviously hadn't been picked up. So yeah, very important. Same with places, like towns, cities, countries, worlds, anything location-y. Do you have sacred mountains? Have you got a name for it? Make sure you have that name correctly. Animals, does your characters have pets? Horses, are there species of animals that you've referred to? Is it weird? Let's be honest, if it's sci-fi or fantasy, it's probably going to have a weird name, so do a search on that, make sure they're all correct. Deities, swords, if swords have names, we have Excalibur, that sort of thing. You have to think about that, because those little things like a misspell of a character's name or a location will be caught by a reader, and it will piss them off, and they'll probably put it in the review. And I say that as someone who does that. I am that sort of person. If I keep seeing the wrong name or a thing pop up, I will make a comment about it in a review. I am really not a good person for that. Another good category is repeating words. We are all drawn to words that we seem to like, and you think you aren't until you read through your manuscript and you suddenly catch the same word hopping up. My partner told me that mine was stood. Apparently all my characters stood there, or stood over there, or the mountain stood tall, or everything was stood, and I hadn't noticed it. And then I started highlighting them in bold on one page. Oh my god, there were so many. So try and catch repeating words. I always remember I read a book, I can't remember what it's called now, and what was it? It was everything was God something. It was like the God pole, the God gate, and I think part of it was understandable, but I think it went too far, and it became like all you could hear was God something, God something, God something, God, and it pulled you out of the story. It really did. Now you've probably sat there going, oh my god, have I got to read through and try and think of which words are the most used? No, you don't. There is a website called Word Counter. I think it's wordcounter.com. I will check. There will be a link in the description. And it was created by Stephen Morgan Friedman. And what it is you can put some of your story in. I don't think you can put like all of it. I think you've got you have to do it by section. It will give you a word count, which might be helpful. But it also shows you the top 10 keywords or keyword density. So it helps you catch the overused words. It gives it like a percentage, like how many times you've used this specific word. I don't think it does it for like the and. It's the chunky keywords that you use. So obviously I think it's more like for blogs and everything, but it can be used for novels. You put it in and it will tell you which of those words you've been using too many. And yes, you might have to do it in pieces, but you can also just then write down, okay, in chapter 1, these were my words. In chapter 2, oh, look, it's the same big words. Same words that keep popping up over and over again. And then you can use a search to try and break that down and change them. But obviously, don't do a search, find them and change them to the same word or something different. You got to be careful of doing that too. And also maybe make a list of those repeating words and then give it to your betas and say, like, do these come up too much? Or even go with a highlighter pen, and every time you find one, highlight it. And once you've got that nice visual in color, you'll know that it's too much.
I haven't heard of word counter at all, so I'll definitely have to look into that. But something else that I recently discovered like yesterday, so I haven't looked into it much. I don't know how good it is, but other people have said how great it is Word Hippo. And I think Word Hippo is just like another thesaurus type website, but I think you can just add in anything and it'll give you like a massive list of other things you can do. Because repeating words is a huge issue for myself. My characters sigh and roll their eyes all the time. I don't know why, but it's just, it is what it is. So yeah, definitely use Word Counter. Check out Word Hippo, because that seems like a really fun website that I could go down a rabbit hole with. But also, like, if you have Scrivener, you can use that as well. If you go onto your stats, it'll tell you how many times you have used all of your words, like even the word it counts it. So you can kind of see your top 10 words or whatever, and you can change it. How many times have you used the word sigh? You can change it to something else. And you could also just use, I don't know what the Mac shortcut is, but if you have Windows, you could do Control F and it'll do the find thing and type in any word, and it'll show you how many times it appears and it'll highlight it for you so you can like visually see it. And you can do this for your whole manuscript, or you could do it chapter by chapter or scene by scene or however it is you write. I find that to be easy. I agree with Ari. If you find that you overuse a word so many times, don't find one alternative and then change some of them to that alternative. And then you have like 50% this word and 50% that word. Try to broaden your vocabulary a little bit. Find like 10 synonyms and change it up, and just try to think of different creative ways to change somebody rolling their eyes, for example.
I just read a book recently and every character was an eye roller, like every character, to the point where it's like, okay, some of you have got to be something else. They can't all be eye rollers. Like, seriously, where's this Scrivener thing? I've been on Scrivener for ages. I didn't know I did that. Where have you seen that?
I can't explain it to you now because I'm on the wrong computer. Scrivener is on my laptop, but it's, I think if you go to the stats at the top, and if you look at like the project stats or something, at the bottom of the box, it'll have a little box and it'll show all of the things.
Okay, Rachel's going to send me how to do that. I am going to try and do that, and then I'll take a screenshot and I'll put on YouTube, I will put like a little thing showing where to do it as well. So anyone who's using Scrivener who's like me going, I didn't know that, we'll put that on there.
Now I gotta make a note for myself because I won't remember to do that.
Rachel has homework.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, well, Rachel makes herself a note because she will forget otherwise. We're going to move on and talk about dialogue. Okay, so another one to kind of keep an eye on for your editing checklist is dialogue tags. Keep an eye on them. Make sure you're not using lots of other words or a certain word. Again, it's repetitive, or constantly avoiding said. Now, there's that annoying concept that's like, oh, said is dead, or said is the only thing you should use. It feels like there's groups of people and they're just so divided on. Some people only ever use said and nothing else, and some people never use said and use every other word than said. I am in the middle because I like to sit in the middle with most things. I think said is a really useful word. Try and use it a lot. But I also think that sometimes it's just not enough, and throw in some extra words. But yeah, so kind of keep an eye on that. That obviously is personal perspective, your own experience, what you want to do. I can't say don't use too many saids, but just keep an eye on your dialogue tags. Make sure that you're not overusing the names. It shouldn't be blah, 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 said John. Blah, 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 said John. Blah, 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 said John. It's like, yeah, okay, we get it. John said stuff. Could he keep his mouth shut? Same with large speeches of your characters started monologuing for pages and pages. Keep an eye on that. Break it up with action, and I'm talking moving around the room, drinking from something, opening the curtains. I'm not talking swinging a sword unless the speech is happening during a fight, and then swing those swords, people. I see we've already done overuse of names. Catching adverbs. Okay, I'm going to be again in the middle because you get people going, oh, adverbs are really bad. An adverb, it means you've got a weak verb. It's like people say, oh, he said angrily, and angrily is the adverb, where really it should be, you know, he growled or he snarled or he yelled, and that's a stronger word than angrily being tacked on to said. However, I do think some adverbs work, just my opinion. I don't think there's a massive issue. Yes, sometimes you need a stronger verb. But yeah, I would just try not to have too many adverbs. You shouldn't have an adverb at the end of every friggin' dialogue tag. That's too many. Okay, that's too many. But yeah, that's, if you're someone who hates adverbs, then definitely put that on a keep an eye on. If you're someone who loves adverbs, maybe just tone it back, just because a lot of readers aren't big on too many adverbs, and it can weaken your writing a little bit. My opinion. Just take it with a grain of salt as usual.
I think the thing with adverbs, I agree with you. I am in the middle with adverbs. I think adverbs are totally okay to use, because otherwise, why do they exist? I mean, they exist for some reason, but I think if you always use them, it sounds repetitive. Even though you're not using the same word, just having the ly at the end and having the same suffix all the time, I feel like it reads weird. So that's kind of where I am with adverbs. You just sprinkle them about. Don't have it be for every single dialogue tag or action or whatever.
Yes, exactly. It needs to be little bits. Dialogue's quite important, so if you can catch those tags and you can think about what you want to do, it's a good idea. And to be honest, I hate it when people overuse names while they're dialogue tagged, you know, in the dialogue tags. But you don't always realize you've done it until you start reading through, especially if you can read it out loud. Oh, you see them then, hear them then. Yeah, so that's another one. Good one to try. Read them out loud. We're trying to keep this episode short, so I'm speeding through them. POV, this is my bugbear. I am awful with POV. My personal suggestion is at the beginning of your chapter, make a note on the top of the page whose POV it's meant to be, all right? And track it. So literally write it in big letters at the top whose POV it's meant to be, and then do a POV read where you only read it to make sure the right person is talking. I have done numerous edits of my manuscripts in the past and still found POV issues that I had. Like, there'll be like 2 lines where I've switched POV and didn't notice, you know, where I've talked about the main character who's supposed to be talking about what their grin looks like, but they don't know what their grin looks like because they're not looking in a friggin' mirror. It's coming from the other person's POV, and I'm forever catching it. So POV is a big bugbear with a lot of people, not just me. I know it's not just me. So definitely keep an eye on that. And if you switch POV in the middle of a chapter, if you have a hard break or something and you switch POV, totally fine. Make sure you're aware of whose POV that's meant to be and keep an eye on it, because it can get confusing for your readers.
POV is hard, and it's something that you're going to have to try different POVs before you realize which is the correct POV for your novel. And I say this from experience because when I first started my mystery novel, it was in first person through Lila, and then it was in first person through George, and then it just wasn't working. So I decided to do first person through Lila, and there was still just something not working. And I realized that if I did first person POV for her, she would need to be in every single scene, and she's not. So I ended up switching it to third person, and that seems to be what worked best. And obviously, as Ari said, if you have dual POVs, you need to make sure that you're consistent with your chapters. And you can switch POVs between chapters however you want. Like, you can have the same POV for like 3 chapters in a row and then switch it if you really want. For me personally, if a story is going to have dual POVs, I prefer them to be even and alternate. Like, if you have 2 different POVs, it's like, see character 1 for the odd chapters and character 2 for the even chapters, for example. You can do whatever you want, do whatever is best for your story. Just personal preference. I like it when it's even.
I get that. I know I try and do that with my own because I have multiple POVs, and obviously I have multiples, but there's 2 main characters that I try and do, and then I have other ones nipping in because I just like that, and that's my thing. I have to admit, every now and then there might be the odd chapter that it's like 2 chapters before the same character, but yeah, overall it feels more, if you're bringing in 2 main characters, it does feel better if there's more evenness. It doesn't have to be, you know, one, then one, then one, then one. Over the whole story, I think it does need to be a bit more even. I think Rachel's completely right with that. Otherwise, it feels a bit odd, especially if you start even and then suddenly the end of the novel is just one person's POV for ages.
Well, I think the other thing is too, it's easy to forget about certain characters. And depending on how your reader reads and comprehends things, that what they'll read like one POV and then they'll read the next POV for the next like 5 chapters and instantly forget about the previous POV. And it's kind of something like, I mean, I'll use The Lord of the Rings as an example, even though The Lord of the Rings is fine. We can't nitpick that one because it's glorious. But I'll use it as an example, like watching the movies. There are times like Two Towers, we're with Frodo and Sam for a little bit, and then it switches to Merry and Pippin, and then it switches back to Frodo and Sam, and then it switches to the other group, and I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about them. I forgot that they're also in this. And it's just, if too much time passes between one POV versus another, then it's like, you kind of forget in a way. That makes any sense.
I have to admit, if you read books with parts, it can actually work really well, because for some of my favorite books start with parts, so like part 1, and it'll bounce between 2 or 3 POVs of this like group, and you'll get like maybe 12, 13, 14 chapters, and then it'll have a cliffhanger, and then it's part 2, and suddenly we're introduced to a whole new set of people, again 2 or 3 people, and they're in their POV, and you get another like 14 chapters, and you're getting really endorsed with them, and then they have a cliffhanger, and guess what, we're back to the original, like, oh my god, I forgot about them, and there's almost this excitement, but at the same time you're like, what's going on with the second group?
Yeah, no, but see, that's fine. That's okay, because you're utilizing the POV in like a unique way, and you're also utilizing cliffhangers. So it's like, yeah, you can make it work for you, but obviously readers are going to have their own preference about it. But the bottom line is, when you're editing, we kind of went off topic, but when you're editing, just make sure your POV is consistent. However you decide to do it, you got to make sure it's consistent.
I agree.
And you're not head hopping.
Oh god,
that's a whole nother issue,
which I think we covered, so I will put a link to that video somewhere.
Yeah, see, we're referencing stuff. Yay. So I don't remember when we talked about it.
No, it's probably really recently as well, but no.
Probably, who knows.
Okay, so the next section, which is quite a good one to look at, is chapters. So for this, you want to be looking at the beginning of the chapter. Has it got enough hook? Is it pulling your reader in? We're not just talking about chapter 1, because some people can actually push through chapter 1 even if it's not great. But if chapter 2, 3, 4 are all bad, that's not going to help. So you want something good happening at the beginning of the chapter, and then obviously you think about ending. It doesn't always have to be a cliffhanger. There's this weird thing going around where it's like every ending of a chapter has to be like dun dun. It doesn't, but it does need to make you want to know more. You know, it has to be something that pushes you to the next one. So kind of have a look at each of your chapters. Are they strong enough to pull the reader into the next chapter? Timeline, are you keeping an eye on your timeline through each chapter? And obviously, if you're writing multiple characters, multiple POVs, definitely keep an eye on the timeline. And also, if you're doing quests where people are like having to walk or ride or sail a certain distance, keep an eye that you're not going, oh my god, it's going to take us 18 weeks, and then suddenly 3 days later they're there. Keep an eye on that. Character balance as well. We've kind of just touched on that with what Rachel said. With if you're doing different POVs, you want to make sure that if you have 2 or 3 main characters, they do need to have kind of equal time throughout your chapters. Yeah, so your characters need to have a balance. You don't want to have one character as the main POV and then right in the middle just throw in some other person randomly and then give them a lot more time and then suddenly they've gone again. So try and look at a bit of balance. Again, this is personal suggestion. Balance does work quite well. Dialogue, we've talked about this in another episode, so I'll link to that. Balance between dialogue and description. We've talked about whether how you can do that, or if you are more of a dialogue writer to a description writer and vice versa. Lots of stuff in that episode, so I'm not going to go over it again because we did a whole episode on it. I am just going to make a note of all these episodes I need to link to because I just remembered. Do you have anything to add to that, or should I just carry on?
No. Go for it.
Okay, next we're moving on to sentences. I love sentences. I think a lot of writers kind of have a habit of falling into writing visual descriptors, but you have to remember to use all 5 senses. And when I say that, I don't mean all the time. We don't want every single time a character's on screen, on page, to be talking about what the clothes feel like against their skin and the smell in the air and the taste on their mouth. No. It just doesn't always have to be visual. Are your characters walking through a market? Then maybe, scents and sounds are a good one to reference. Is there like a stinky fish market over there and they're like, it's very pungent? Is there the sounds of people bartering in the corner? Are they getting hawked at to buy some beef? I don't everything in my head went out of it. It's like I had no idea what you could sell in the market. And you got to remember that senses are really good for adding tone and mood and atmosphere. If you think about horror writing, it's not always the visual image, especially if you watch horror movies. Sometimes the room is really dark and it's like the weird scraping that you can hear in the corner, or the ruffle of something running past, like in the dark. So it's not always a visual thing. So yeah, remember to think about the five senses. Definitely make a note. I used to always write at the top of my chapter. This is what I did whenever I printed out. I'd write on five senses, and then I would go through and I would like either highlight or circle whenever I was just using visual, because you don't mean to, it just kind of happens. But just kind of remind yourself, throw in some sense, throw in some tastes, throw in some what are the other ones? Sounds. There we go.
I was about to say smell, but then I just realized you just said that.
And I tell you, so many people miss touch. And you think about like the texture of clothing, someone just touching your arm, the feel of hair brushing your face, the salt air brushing into your face. There's so many. It's one of those ones that often gets not misused. It often gets overlooked. And I think we need more touch. That sounds bad. I'm going to reel that back. Touch. Yeah, just consider using more of the five senses. I should not go off script. It makes me very...
I mean, to be fair, though, when you started talking about senses, the one and only example I thought of, because I write murder mysteries, I was like, if there's a dead body, depending on how long it's been there, your character is going to smell it.
Exactly. And the tang of blood, that coppery tang of blood. And
yes.
That, decomp. Lovely.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Glorious. I mean, that's pretty much, that's all I had to add to that, is that dead body smell. Yeah. That's all.
Exactly. So... such a weird thing. And if you're not writing murder mysteries, other things smell too. Think about it. Okay, yeah, I'm completely lost what I'm doing. What am I doing? Yeah, another one is good to add is inconsistencies. This is where you've accidentally changed the color of your character's hair midway, or their eyes, or maybe you forgot how tall they were, or whether they were left-handed. I've done that before. I was like, yeah, this character's left-handed, and then completely forgot. And, they were always like reaching for things with their right hand. Not that it's a thing you often think about, but yeah, it does come up. Another one that, again, I have a bad thing with is forgetting what time of day it is. Did you start the scene at nighttime and it's only been 20 minutes and suddenly they're outside and it's like the sun's been out for ages? Especially if you're a scene writer or you don't write linearly. If you don't write linearly, cannot say that word, because if you're bouncing around, sometimes it's hard to keep track of what time of day it is, because you were writing a night scene and then you jumped to a day scene. So yeah, keep an eye on those kind of consistencies. Again, this is just my thing. Look at the chapter, do a quick scan through and say, right, this is happening in this location. These are the main characters who are in it. This is the time of day or the day of the week. I needed a calendar for my current work in progress, because it went through a certain number of days after something had happened. And I needed to track how many days, because on the third day, something else was going to happen. And I had to make sure I got to the third day, and on the third day, it happened. So keep an eye on that. This is why we need character profiles. Quick reference guides are good, so that you're not going, what color is that person's eyes? Is it like milky white, or did I make them like light green? Or so yeah, inconsistencies. You'll be surprised how many pop up. You think you know your characters, but after you've written like 20 of them, some of them will like drift off and you'll forget what they look like. So small inconsistencies. Locations, like, is the mountain range in the north? Then you need to make sure your characters are riding north if they're going to the mountains, and then think about where the sun is on their back. That is getting a little intense. That is kind of where my brain goes, but you'll be surprised how many people will read and nitpick, me being one of them.
No, I mean, that's all good points, because inconsistencies, they're gonna happen. No matter how well your notes are, the inconsistencies will happen, because hopefully when you're having a writing session, you just kind of go with the flow and the words come and you go with it. So you're not really thinking about like all the logistics of like the editing, which is why you should have an editing checklist. I like to write down editing notes as I write so that I remember to go back to it later. And this is true for fact checking and research. This will help with those inconsistencies, and also just making sure that your novel as a whole makes sense. Again, I'll use murder mysteries as an example, because this kind of goes along with the whole timeline thing, the inconsistencies. That an autopsy report, I guess it depends on where you're from, but an autopsy report can take 4 to 6 weeks. Or no, not sorry, geez. A toxicology report can take 4 to 6 weeks to complete. What's the word I'm looking for? You know what I'm talking about. So in that sense, if you want your novel to have some sort of realism, what's going to happen within those 4 to 6 weeks? for those characters? Are you just going to time skip 4 weeks ahead, or can other things happen? Other things should happen within those 4 weeks, because that's a month to a month and a half. That's a long time. So yeah, I mean, that's all I gotta add. Oh, something else. I like to use Scapple, and this is also by Literature and Latte, who also created Scrivener. And Scapple is a mind mapping tool, and I actually like to use that for timelines and for character profiles, so I can catch those inconsistencies. I also have notes in Scrivener. I have notes everywhere so that I can hopefully remember these things, which I never do, but you know what? It works. Scapple is great for that, because then, and even like the time of day and just different locations. Like if you when you're world building and you have a country in the middle, and then have the different states. I'm using the United States as an example. You used to have the different states branch out, and then from that you have the cities and towns, and you can really zero in on where your characters are. I'm going off topic. That's all.
No, that was good. You'd be surprised how much you need to think of when editing if you want to really polish your manuscript. I think we do these things like, writing, editing. There's one giant umbrella, and it can be very overwhelming if you're just thinking, I've got to edit. Whereas if you can at least break things down and think about, like the research and fact checking you need to do, the inconsistency you need to keep an eye on, the senses, it just makes life a little bit easier. Yes, you're going to read your manuscript a lot, but to be fair, even if you just did a random read through over and over to catch, the usual spelling errors, you're probably going to need to read it several times anyway. I think if you read it through and pick specific categories and read it through only looking for those, it gives you a stronger sense. Again, personal opinion, because you're not thinking about anything else, you're reading through, and to be honest, the more read-throughs you do, you will more likely to catch things. And the more you can catch before you give it to your betas, before you give it to your editor, who will charge you, the more they have to find, the cheaper it will be. As an extra resource, one of our writing friends, KM Allen, did a load of blog posts on different types of checklists for editing. Absolutely brilliant. And I mean, she covers things like weak words, delete checklists, active words, basic scenes, stage directions. And she goes through each one of those and discusses what you can look for in your manuscript. I think it's brilliant. So she's actually got a page with all the links on. I'm going to add that main link to our description. So have a check out of her blog and those checklists. Take what you think works for you. Really good resource. I will also link to WordHippo and wordcounter.net, apparently, not .com. And all those will be linked below. So see, lots of resources for you in this episode, if I remember to do it. Okay, I don't think I've got anything else to add. Rach, anything?
No, I think you wrapped it up really nicely, actually.
I know we don't usually do such a good wrap. It's like, you're just like, okay, that's it.
I know, yeah, that's it. Here we go.
With that, we'll turn it over to you guys. Do you use a checklist for editing, or do you think you'll start doing? Let us know your answers in the comments so we can chat about it. Remember, we release new episodes every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing writing in multiple genres, and we'll be joined by a special guest. To ensure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button on your way out. As always, thank you for listening to the Merry Writer Podcast, and we'll see you next week. This podcast is brought to you by Arguments Over Tea and Coffee. Which side are you on? The music, titled Inspired, is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.